If you notice the topic for this afternoon, I'm going to be looking at something that we have looked at a lot during the course of our webinars. Over the past few years, one of the things we have done many times is examine the subject of the feast days. And I'm only going back to it this afternoon because we are looking at popular errors in Christendom, popular errors. And we can't go through a series like this without looking at feast days, because whatever anybody wants to think, I am convinced that feast day observance is positively harmful, and it's a danger to New Testament Christianity. Now, I know that there are many well-meaning Christians who observe the feast days. But you know, last week we spoke about some of the errors, like the Hebrew Israelites. We talked about people who believe that they are the Jews, and they believe that by having some connection to the Jewish nationality, even a physical connection, it puts them at an advantage. It gives them favor with God. And I believe that feast keeping, even though it's based on a slightly different principle, but I believe that feast keeping and similar practices are also harmful in a similar way as what we looked at last week. Now, the first thing I want to do is to look at some of the rationale that people will present as the reasons why they keep the feast. Now, most of you know, or all of you should know, that I'm a person who observes the 7-day Sabbath. And that is one of the first things that people will say, that if you keep the Sabbath, you have a right to be a feast keeper. And I'm going to just go to my Bible and look at a couple of places, a couple of the arguments that they will use to support this kind of conclusion. In Leviticus chapter 23, this is one of the main arguments. In Leviticus chapter 23, it gives us a list of the different feasts that the Jews were supposed to keep. And if you let me go to the beginning of the chapter where it says, Leviticus 23. Beginning in verse 1, it says, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, Concerning the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest and holy convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. So look at how the Sabbath is bracketed. It starts by saying the Israelites are to keep the feasts. These are my feasts. And then it talks about it gives you the Sabbath. And then it goes on to say again, these are the feasts of the Lord. And after this, now it gives you the 7 feasts. So feast keepers say that when God talks about the feasts that are to be kept, the Sabbath is included as the first of them. I'll tell you something that is a little strange. Now, I agree that the Sabbath is put right in there at the beginning when God mentions that these are the feasts, and the first thing he mentions is the Sabbath. But let me point out something that a thoughtful person could pick up for himself. The feasts were practices, were ceremonies that were observed, all of them, once per year. They were annual festivals. Now, in case you didn't think of this, you should make a note of it. The feasts were annual festivals. In other words, each of these feasts took place once per year. And as we have seen already, in the past we have looked at this subject, what we have seen is that every year the Jews repeated the cycle of observing the feasts once per year, over and over. And we have come to understand that these feasts were symbols representing great events in God's plan of saving the human race. There were 7 of them. And of course we know the first was the Passover, and the last of them was the Feast of Tabernacles, from the death of Jesus right up until the time when God takes his people out of this earth. 7 great feasts. Now, so every year the Hebrews rehearsed the plan of redemption. Every year. They started with Passover, the death of Christ, and they ended with the Feast of Tabernacles, which represented the time when they would be taken out of this earth. So, and you had there 5 in between, which showed you different stages in this plan. For example, everybody knows that Pentecost took place 50 days after the crucifixion of Christ. So it was something that was another step in the plan, in God's plan of saving humanity. The day of Pentecost was. So all of these feasts represented something, some step, something that Jesus would do in his course of saving mankind. The Sabbath was not like this. The Sabbath was something that occurred every day, every week. Once every week, once every 7 days, you had the 7th-day Sabbath. So that alone should make us know that the Sabbath was not one of these annual feasts. So it is true that when God gave Moses the law on Mount Sinai, he included the 7th-day Sabbath among those laws, and the 7th-day Sabbath was used as a type of the rest that we will find in Christ. Paul talks about this in Hebrews chapter 4. But the Sabbath was established before man committed sin. From the time that the world was first created, in the first week of creation, God established the Sabbath as a meeting place between him and his people, as a time for God's people to experience spiritual rest and for special fellowship with the Lord. It was set apart for a holy purpose. It was sanctified. So the Sabbath existed long before the feasts were given. The feasts were established as symbols representing salvation. Now mark that point, because some feast keepers try to say that the feasts existed from God created the world, because God gave the times, God set up times for seasons, and they say that one of these seasons, or some of these seasons, were the feast days. But that's not possible, because the feast days are symbols of the plan of salvation. Before man sinned, there were no symbols in place for the plan of salvation. It would have been like God established the program of recovery from sin before sin actually took place. So we know that God had the plan in his mind, but that plan was not implemented until man sinned, because there was no need for it until man sinned. So God never established feast keeping, shadows and types and illustrations. God never established these before man even sinned. So that's an argument that is unreasonable, and it doesn't hold water. Now, the problem with feast keeping, I really have tried to understand why it is that people become so attached to feast keeping. I try to understand. And it's difficult to understand if you're not a feast keeper, and I've never been a feast keeper. So I can't really figure out the psychology or the mindset that makes people so obsessed with feast keeping. But one thing I know is that there is a tendency that exists in humanity, and it's not absent from professing Christians. Even genuine Christians, there's a tendency that is in the human race where human beings like to do things. They like to perform with a subliminal idea. Sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's subliminal. It's the idea that my performance or my behavior or my practices are a way of drawing me closer to God. Now, this may be, I mean, it's an idea that is very prominent, very popular in pagan religions, in non-Christian religions, in every religion that I know of, apart from true Christianity. In every religion that I know of, you obtain favor with God if they believe in God. Some don't believe in God. They believe in some kind of God, yes, but not a personal God. But they still believe that you obtain favor with the universe or with the forces of good and evil by living a good life. The vast majority of human beings believe that your practices, your ceremonies, are a way of gaining merit with God or with the universe. It's a universal instinct of human nature for some reason or the other. Now, even within Christendom, there are many branches of Christianity, many denominations and many religious groups that believe that your performance is what qualifies you for salvation. Or they may not say it as brazenly as this, but subliminally the idea is there that if I perform, if I carry out certain practices, this endears me to God. This makes me better qualified to please God. And I believe, I'm going to say at the beginning, I believe that feast keeping falls into this category, because I really am really amazed. I'm really at a loss to discover what it is that about feast keeping that appeals to people so much. And the best I can figure out is that it's a visible form of demonstrating how committed you are as a Christian. It's a visible form. People choose different ways to do this. Some people cover their heads, and they think that by covering their heads it makes them more visibly religious. Some people choose to wear a certain color. Some people choose, in Jamaica you'll see some people walking with a stick. Different ways. Some people grow their locks long. Different ways of trying to outwardly, visibly put on a show that says to people, I am a holy person. Because when we understand the New Testament, when we understand the New Covenant, it becomes blessedly simple to understand that the only thing that really qualifies a person for salvation is faith in Jesus Christ. Yes, somebody might argue that, and I would agree, somebody might argue that there are lessons in the feast days. There are lessons in these feasts for God's people. God established these feasts to be types and illustrations of the plan of salvation. And so, if we believe in the plan of salvation, if we want to be involved in the plan of salvation, it is beneficial if we understand these feasts. And they will go on further to say that the best way to understand them is to practice them. That is one argument. However, I would say that the study of the feasts is good. The practice of the feasts is not a healthy thing for a Christian to do. And I'm going to demonstrate that the Bible teaches this. The Bible teaches this principle. And probably the first place that I would go to in demonstrating this is, of course, in the New Testament. I would go to the book of Galatians. Now, Galatians is one of those books, as we know, where Paul was extremely concerned because there were people who were involved in following Paul around from place to place. There were people who were involved in following Paul from place to place. And they were trying to impose on the people that Paul converted. They were trying to tell these people that it was not good enough for them to simply believe in Jesus, but they also needed to keep the law of Moses. And so the book of Galatians is Paul's response to this. Paul was responding to people who were doing exactly what I believe feast keepers are doing today. Now, there are some of these feast keepers. They are not telling everybody that they need to keep the feasts. Okay? Granted, there are some of them who are saying, we are just keeping it. Okay, we're not telling anybody else to keep it, but we believe that by keeping it, we are benefiting ourselves. Okay, so the only way those people are impacting other people is that they are setting an example, and their teaching makes people believe that feast keeping enhances your experience as a Christian. So while they may not be pushing it on other people, they are certainly teaching it in a second-hand way. While there are others who maybe the majority of them go on to say that actually keeping these feasts is necessary for salvation, because they believe that keeping the feasts are as important as keeping the Ten Commandments. They try to put them on an equality. They try to make out that these feast days, what they refer to as the statutes, they say these feast days were specifically given by God to enhance the understanding of the Ten Commandments and to guard the Ten Commandments. And so they put these feast days ceremonies on an equality with the Ten Commandments. So that if you break the Ten Commandments, you know you are in rebellion against God. So therefore, it would follow that if you break the feast-keeping commandments, you are also in rebellion against God. So they do teach that you need to keep the feasts in order to be in favor with God, in order to live a life that is pleasing to God. Now, Paul encountered these people, and while, there are some who debate as to whether or not he was mentioning feast days as a matter of what these people were teaching. And I'm strongly persuaded that Paul was teaching that feast days was a part of what they were promoting when they were following Paul around. Now, let me show you what the Bible says about these people. In Acts chapter 15, it says, "And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, Except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved." So it starts by saying that these people were promoting circumcision. Paul and Barnabas had a big argument with them. And it was determined that Paul and Barnabas should go up to Jerusalem unto the apostles and the elders about this question. And what happens when they get there? It says, "There rose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees which believed, saying that it was needful to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses." This is what they were pushing on the Gentile believers. Now you will notice that the people who were most prominent in promoting this were the Pharisees, from the Pharisees. Now, maybe surprisingly, some of these Pharisees had accepted the doctrine had accepted Christianity. But if you read the New Testament, one of the things that will come out at you is that the Jewish believers, primarily those who were focused in Jerusalem, who were stationed in Jerusalem, were very concerned that the Jews should continue observing the Old Testament system. They were not just interested in keeping feast days, but in circumcision and in the entire law of Moses. And now they are saying, these Pharisees who used to be the leaders in the old system, now they have come over to Christianity and they have a great deal of influence. In Jamaica we would say they have big chat. They have a great deal of influence. And they are saying that we have to command them to keep the law of Moses. Notice they're talking to the Gentiles, because it says, Paul and Barnabas was declaring the conversion of the Gentiles. That's what they are telling the people about. And the scribes and Pharisees, the Pharisees say, of course, you don't have any scribes in this group because you don't have any Sadducees in this group because the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. So as far as they are concerned, Jesus was never raised from the dead. But some of the Pharisees come across and they say it's necessary to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. The law of Moses here embraces all that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai by God. They say they believe in Jesus Christ, but they have to also keep the law of Moses. This tells you that something you can pick up right here is that up to this point, the Jewish believers were continuing to do exactly like they did in the Old Testament times, only that they now believed in Jesus. Now they believed that Jesus saved them, but they continued the practices of the law of Moses. They were still circumcising. I'm not sure if they were still offering animal sacrifices. Maybe they came to recognize that Jesus was a true sacrifice, and so they stopped offering animal sacrifices. And yet that's not quite true. That's not quite true. In Acts chapter 21, there is something that happens that makes me believe they were still offering sacrifices. They did not understand the change that took place through Jesus Christ. They believe he came to save them, but they did not understand that it meant that the old system was completely obsolete now. Look what it says. They encouraged Paul in Acts chapter 21. They encouraged Paul that he was to meet with some other Jews and to take an oath with them, to take a Nazarite vow with them. And they were to shave their heads and purify themselves in the temple. And look what it says in verse 26. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. It seems that what they were supposed to do was to go through this period of purification, and at the end of time, there was to be a sacrifice for them. This was a part of the whole ceremony. And this is what they recommended that Paul should do, so he could convince the Jews that he was a good Jew and that he was keeping the law. And we know that Paul agreed to submit to them against his better judgment. Now, this is the problem that Paul was facing in Galatia. These people came down there and they were telling the people that they should have been circumcised and keep the law of Moses. And so in the book of Galatians, Paul is writing to these Galatians. It's a letter to the Galatians, and Paul is trying to help them to understand. And, you know, the webinar is too short to go through chapters 3 and 4, but we should really go through those chapters. But let me just show you something that he says in chapter 5. I will have to do a kind of synopsis because there's just too much. But the book of Galatians especially, I want to focus on this evening because I want us to understand the danger of feast keeping. All right? I've been asked this question in the past. Somebody has asked me this question. Different people have asked me the question. Why do I have such a vendetta against feast keeping? Why don't I leave the people alone and let them keep their feasts if they want to? And the reason is because I am a preacher of the gospel. And whatever is contrary to the gospel, I and every person who is teaching the truth of God, we have to stand up against what is false. We not only need to teach what is true, but we need to expose what is false, or what can be a hindrance to the experience of Christians. Now, those who are locked into their practices, maybe we can't break through to them. But there are people who are genuinely seeking for truth, who may not recognize the principles involved, and it is for these people why I feel that we need to expose this, the anti-spiritual nature of feast keeping, anti-new covenant nature of feast keeping. Listen to what Paul says in chapter 5. We'll go back to chapter 4 in a moment, but look at chapter 5. Paul says, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty. Liberty is freedom, wherewith Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. This yoke of bondage that he's talking about is the yoke of the old covenant law. I'm going to show you this in a moment. And furthermore, you can find it right here in this passage, because when he talks about the yoke of bondage, look at what he says next. This makes it clear. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, what is he talking about? He's talking about a practice of the law of Moses. If you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. Now, here is the point. Here is the danger. Here is the danger. Paul says this, but we are intelligent people. And what I want us to ask ourselves is a question. Why is it that if a man is circumcised, Christ profits him nothing? Why? What does it matter to Christ if a man removes a foreskin? How does that stop a man from being saved? I mean, it seems like a trivial thing. Somebody goes and has this medical procedure, and he removes a part of his body. And Paul says, if you do this, Christ profits you nothing. Now, first of all, let us note, before we even look at why this is so, let us notice that what Paul is saying is that this practice, this seemingly innocent practice, can cost a person his salvation. Now, we know it is not the practice that does it, and I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going to prove it to you in Acts 16. Let me go back to... All right, in Acts 16, I want you to notice something that happened here. It talks about the journey of Paul. It says, then he came to Derbe and Lystra. And behold, a certain disciple was there named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman which was a Jewess and believed, but his father was a Greek. Look what it says next. Him would Paul have to go forth with him, and took and circumcised him. Paul circumcised this guy called Timothy. And yet Paul says in Galatians 5 that if you be circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing. How then did Paul take Timothy and circumcise him? Well, it says in the right panel, Paul did it because of the Jews which were in those quarters. So here we see that the reason why Paul circumcised Timothy was because he was trying to please the Jews. So if you are circumcised because you are trying to please the Jews, it's okay. But if you are circumcised for another reason, it's not okay. Notice the point is that the point is not circumcision itself. The point is the reason why you are circumcised. That is the point. Now, I understand that Paul, whenever he ministered among the Jews, he tried to remove prejudice from them. He tried to remove their bias. That is why the verse we read earlier on in Acts chapter 21, he took this vow and he shaved his head because he was trying to please the Jews. He was trying to take away their prejudice so he might have a way of reaching them with the gospel. He did not do these things because he believed they were necessary to his salvation or for his Christian experience. You see the point? As far as his Christian experience was concerned, What did Paul believe? Let me show you what Paul believed as far as his Christian experience was concerned. Colossians chapter 2, look at what he says. He says, beware lest any man, from verse 8 to verse 10. Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. He says, be careful. For in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and ye are complete in him. That is what Paul believed. You are complete in Christ. You don't need anything else. So when you have Jesus Christ, you have everything you need for salvation and for your religion. And he goes on to talk about we are circumcised in him. We are buried with him in baptism. And he goes on to talk about he took away the handwriting of ordinances that was against us. And he says, therefore, you should not let anybody judge you in respect of food or drink, or in respect of a holy day or the new moon or the Sabbaths. So he's saying that as Christians, these are superficial, extraneous things. They are not necessary, because in Jesus Christ, you are complete. You don't need any of these traditions of men. You don't need any of these rudiments of the world. And that is why he says here, if you are circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. He's talking about motive. A man who is circumcised for a medical reason is fine. A man who is circumcised for a religious reason is in problem. By the same token, I will say a man who keeps the feasts, in order to gain influence with somebody, like the Jews, for example. It's not a religious reason. He doesn't believe it enhances his relationship with Christ. He doesn't believe that the Bible requires it. Such a person is not in a problem, or maybe not in much of a problem. But the person who believes that it is necessary to his relationship with Christ, that person is in problem, because he's keeping the feast for a religious reason. And these are the people to whom Paul says, if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. I testify again to every man that is circumcised. You start keeping one part of the law, that he is a debtor to do the whole law. You are indebted. You are duty bound. You have an obligation to keep the whole law once you start down that road. That's what Paul is saying. You start on that road, you are logically required to do the entire thing, because you start keeping the law. Obviously, the same thing that makes it necessary for you to keep one part of the law, by the same logic, that thing that makes you think you need to keep one part of it, obviously it makes you obligated to keep all of it. And so when your relationship with God is defined by an obligation to the law, Christ profits you nothing. And you have to read the first part of Galatians to understand the strength of what Paul is saying, because Paul has made the point that by the works of the law there shall no flesh be justified. That the law is focused on doing in order to be accepted, and the religion of Jesus Christ is different. It talks about believing. If you look at chapter 3, let's go back to chapter 3, same Galatians here, and if you look at verses verse 12, Paul says, the law is not of faith, but the man that doeth them shall live in them. Notice that this part of the verse, the man that doeth them shall live in them, it's in bolded letters. What this tells me is that this is something that is a quotation from the Old Testament. And if you look at it, it's taken from Leviticus 18 and verse 5. Look at what it says in Leviticus 18 and verse 5. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. So the law teaches that you obtain life by doing. You obtain life by doing. You obtain life by doing the law. So this is what Paul means when he says, that the law is not of faith. The law is not of faith. The law is about doing. So this is why he says that if you approach God through the law, Christ profits you nothing. Because when you approach God through the law, you are trying to obtain favor by doing. Now, I know that somebody will say, well, what about the Ten Commandments? And that is why I always say that the Ten Commandments they're not about doing. The Ten Commandments are simply living the principles of what is inside of you. You're not doing something to obtain favor. You're not doing something in response to a set of rules. When Christ comes to live in you, you simply live by the principle of the new life that is inside of you. And you live, and your life is in harmony with the Ten Commandments. You're not keeping the Ten Commandments. Because if your life is based on doing, if your religious life is based on doing, Christ shall profit you nothing. The law talks about doing, living by doing. But the gospel of Jesus Christ is living by believing in the Son of God. So, feast keeping is a relic. It's a relic from the system of living by doing. It's a relic from the system of living by doing. It's a relic of the system where you please God through keeping a set of rules. Now let's see what Paul says here. When you go to Galatians 4, here's what he says. He's referring to Gentiles, all right, and these Gentiles he regards as the people of God. As a matter of fact, let me go to the same passage. I wanted to look at. I have Galatians 4. Let me put it on the right, and I have Galatians 3 on the left. Okay, chapter 3 and chapter 4. And what I want us to look at is that the last part of chapter 3. Let's go down to the bottom of this chapter. Paul says, as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither bond nor free, there's neither male nor female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. And then he says, if you be Christ's, then are you Abraham's seed? That means you're a Jew. You're a spiritual Jew. And you are heirs, notice this word, you are heirs according to the promise. God made a promise to bless all people through the seed of Abraham. If you belong to Christ, then you become an heir of the promise. Now, Paul is talking about the heir. Who is the heir? It's you and me. We belong to Christ and we have become Abraham's seed. We are inheritors of the promise. The word that means inheritors is the word heirs. Look what he says now in Galatians chapter 4. The next chapter, it continues without a break because there's no chapter breaks in the original scripture. Now I say, I'm telling you that the heir, notice the word, it's the same word. Who is Paul talking about? He's talking about you and me. He's talking about the same people that he talked about down here. You belong to Christ and then you are Abraham's seed. Now I say that the heir, that is you and me, as long as he's a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all. Now here's the problem. Here's the tricky part. When Paul talks about the heir as long as he's a child, is he talking about me, Dejvid Klejton, as an individual, and you put your name there? Is Paul talking about you as an individual and saying, when you were a baby, when I was 10 years old, when I was 5 years old, I was no different from a servant? Is he saying that I personally, God made me, God put me in the position of a servant because I was a physical child? And I'm going to tell you right from the beginning, and we'll look at it in just a moment. Paul is not talking about me, Dejvid Klejton. He's not talking about you, whoever you are. What Paul is talking about is the church of God, or the people of God, as a body. Remember, all of us are one body. As a matter of fact, I think he says something like that. Not in this passage, all right? But he's talking about the people of God as a group. And that is why he says, when the heir, he now uses the illustration of a family where you have a child. And in this family, this child is going to grow up to be the person in charge. He's going to grow up and inherit the estate from his father. He is Lord of all. This child is Lord of all. But as long as he's a child, Paul says, he's no different from a servant. In other words, he is put under the control and the government of somebody else, just like a servant. Somebody dictates how he is to behave, even though he is the heir. He is the one who will inherit everything one day and be in charge of everybody. Since he's a child, because he's a baby, because he's an infant, he's treated like a servant. He's not allowed to be in control because he's not capable of it. And so Paul says he's under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. Now this is so clearly an expression of what we have in chapter 3. Feast keepers deny this, but it is absolutely clear for people who read without any bias. Paul says that the heir is under tutors and governors. Who is a tutor? It's a teacher or a schoolmaster until the time appointed of the Father. Now, in the family that Paul is talking about here, of course, the child will be under a governor, under teachers, until he reaches a certain age, maybe 21, maybe 18. But Paul has already told us the experience of God's people. He says, the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ. We, the people of God, we, the heir, we were under what? Tutors and governors, schoolmaster, same thing. But after that faith is come, after Jesus Christ has come, and we have faith in Christ, the church has come to faith in Christ, we are no longer under a schoolmaster, but we were under these tutors and governors. And Paul says that what was the schoolmaster? What was his tutor? It was the law that was our schoolmaster. He's explaining why God put the Jews under the law. Circumcision, feast keeping, all the rest of it. He was giving the Jews a schoolmaster to bring them unto Christ. And that is why he says in verse 19, a little earlier on up, he says, wherefore then serveth the law? What was the purpose of the law? All these ceremonies and rituals. It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come, until the time appointed of the Father. Galatians 4 is simply repeating what was said in chapter 3, giving us a different illustration, talking about the same thing and explaining it a little better. So the people of God, the people of God, because they were children, they were infants, they were simple children who didn't understand. They had not yet experienced the salvation that Jesus Christ would bring. So until Jesus came, until the seed should come, it's in the seed that we have salvation, it's in the seed that we have deliverance. But until the seed should come, the law was added. And the purpose of the law was to be our schoolmaster, to bring us unto Christ. But after that faith has come, we are no longer under the schoolmaster. And so that's what Paul is saying. He says the heir, the church of God, the people of God, as long as he's a child, using a single child to represent the body of believers, He's under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. And Paul says, even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. Notice we came upon this word already over here in Colossians. We looked at it and I didn't make a comment on it, but you might have noticed it, where Paul says, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy, vain deceit, after the tradition of men. Notice he says, after the rudiments of the world. Paul is saying to the Colossians, don't let anybody bring you under the control of these rudiments of the world. It's the same word that is used here in Galatians chapter 4. We were in bondage under the elements of the world, or the rudiments of the world. It's the same word. I think the Greek word is a word, stoichion. Let me see. I'm not able to bring up the Greek on this side. Over here, rudiments. Stoichion. Strong's Dictionary, G4747. It's the word stoichion, and it means the elements of the world. Same word you have over here that is translated as elements. So Paul says, when we, the people of God, were children, spiritual infants, we were in bondage under the elements of the world. But look at what he says. But when the fullness of the time was come, which time is this? It was the time appointed of the Father. It was the same time that Paul spoke about here in Galatians chapter 3, when he says in verse 19, it was added because of transgressions till the seed should come. It was the same time. It was the fullness of time. When the fullness of the time was come, Christ came in the fullness of time. That was the time that the law had fulfilled its tenure. That's the time that the expiration date of the law had arrived. When the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. He came under the jurisdiction of the law. He came under the system of the law. So he was circumcised. He kept the feast days. He subjected himself to the ceremonies of the law, because he was made under the law. To redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. And somebody says, what does it mean that he came to redeem? The word redeem simply means to purchase, or to buy back, or to bring back. He came to bring back who? Those who were under the law. He took us from under the system of the government of the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. And what this means is that, look, it says we were no different from a servant. We were no different from servants. So what Paul is saying is that God took us out from the state of servanthood, which is under the law, under the tutors and governors, that we might receive the adoption of sons. So instead of being servants, we have grown up and we have become sons of God through the seed. And that's what he says in verse 7. Wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son. Now, here's what Paul says. But now after that you have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn you again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? The problem with the Galatians was they desired to be under the government of the law. And Paul says these are weak and beggarly elements of the world, rudiments of the world. And they were desiring to be in bondage under these elements. Why does he use the word bondage? Because bondage applies to servants. And Paul says when you were children, you were treated like servants. And he says you are going back to the state of bondage. You're going back to being servants. And that is why he says in chapter 5, we already saw in chapter 5, where he says, be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. He's talking about the law. Now, my time is almost up, and so I want to make my bottom line, and it is this, because I know that, how can a person cover a topic like this in 1 hour? I'm just getting warmed up. But the bottom line is this. What we are looking at today is the danger of feast keeping. And I don't want to close this webinar without making the point that the problem with feast keeping is that it takes you back to an obsolete system of religion. It takes you back to the religion that is based on doing and not believing. It takes you back to a place where your relationship with God is defined by elements of the world. You relate to God through the elements of the world. Jesus says those who worship God in this age must worship in spirit and in truth. The former age has passed. How do you think you can please God? How do you think you can worship God in spirit and in truth when your worship is based upon the elements of the world, the system of a former age that God has abolished, upon the old covenant that is based upon elements of the world? This is the danger. A person says, I'm just doing this because I find that it enables me to concentrate better. If you want to do this in the privacy of your own personal space, nobody needs to know about it. Why do you promote it and publicize it and bring other people into it with you? Then it's no longer a personal thing. Then it's something that you're doing on the basis of a religious obligation, a religious duty, a religious principle. It's bringing you back to the kind of religion that is based upon elements of the world. And when a person worships God in this way, you are endangering your salvation. You're also hindering the work of God. So it's not something that a person who understands the new covenant can leave alone. That's why Paul says, I'm telling you that if you are circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. And if you are circumcised, you are duty bound, you are under obligation to do the whole law. And I would say the same thing. If you are keeping feast days, you are duty bound to be circumcised. You should go back to offering animal sacrifices because it's all a part of the same huge system. Everything is based on the same principle, pleasing God by doing rather than by faith. So, as I said, I'm just getting warmed up. But we've basically run out of time, so I have to stop. So, I want to thank you, brothers and sisters, for being with me this afternoon and for sharing with me in this study. I've touched on this subject many times, as I said, but I could not do a series of studies on the harm that is involved in the harmful teachings in Christendom. I couldn't do this without touching upon feast keeping, because no matter what anybody will say, I will always believe it's a practice that is harmful. It is dragging people back. It's a backward step. And it is harming, it is turning people back from the new covenant. And that can never be an innocent thing. It's like people telling people that you need to go back and join the Jewish nation in order to be saved, in order to be accepted of God. It's almost the same thing that they were doing back there, the Pharisees were doing at the Council of Jerusalem. You need to go back to Moses. It's a backward step. It's not a part of the gospel of Jesus Christ, where we deal with spirit and truth and not with form and ceremony.